Hello, good afternoon. Welcome back to part 2 of Poison by Roald Dahl. When last we left off, Dr. Genderby was on his way to the bungalow with serum for the possible snake bite. So, let's finish this story up and see how it turns out. I slipped out to the kitchen, got some ice from the icebox, rolled it up in a napkin, and began to crush it small. That business of the mouth, I didn't like it. Or the way he talked, either. I carried the ice pack back to the bedroom and laid it across Harry's forehead. Here, keep you cool. He screwed up his eyes and drew breath sharply through his teeth. Take it away, he whispered. Makes me cough. His smiling muscle began to twitch again. The beam of a headlamp shone through the window as Ganderby's car swung around to the front of the bungalow. I went out to meet him, holding the ice pack with both hands. How is it? Ganderby asked, but he didn't stop to talk. He walked on past me across the balcony and through the screen doors into the hall. Where is he? Which room? He put his bag down on a chair in the hall and followed me into Harry's room. He was wearing soft-soled bedroom slippers, and he walked across the floor noiselessly, delicately, like a careful cat. Harry watched him out of the sides of his eyes. When Ganderby reached the bed, he looked down at Harry and smiled, confident and reassuring, nodding his head to tell Harry it was a simple matter, and he was not to worry, but just to leave it to Dr. Ganderby. Then he turned and went back to the hall, and I followed him. First thing is to try and get some serum into him, he said, and he opened his bag and started to make preparations. Intravenously, but I must do it neatly. Don't want to make him flinch. We went into the kitchen and he sterilized a needle. He had a hypodermic syringe in one hand and a small bottle in the other, and he stuck the needle through the rubber top of the bottle and began drawing a pale yellow liquid up into the syringe by pulling out the plunger. Then he handed the syringe to me. Hold that till I ask for it. He picked up the bag, and together we returned to the room. Harry's eyes were bright now and wide open. Ganderby bent over Harry, and very cautiously, like a man handling 16th century lace, he rolled up the pajama sleeve to the elbow without moving the arm. I noticed he stood well away from the bed. He whispered, I'm going to give you an injection. Serum. Just a prick, but try not to move. Don't tighten your stomach muscles, just let them go limp. Harry looked at the syringe. Ganderby took a piece of red rubber tubing from his bag and slid one end under and up and around Harry's bicep. Then he tied the tubing tight with a knot. He sponged a small area of the bare forearm with alcohol, handed the swab to me, and took the syringe from my hand. He held it up to the light, squinting at the calibrations, squirting out some of the yellow fluid. I stood still beside him, watching. Harry was watching too, and sweating all over his face so it shone like he was smeared with face cream on his skin and running down onto the pillow. I could see the blue vein on the inside of Harry's forearm, swollen now because of the tourniquet, and then I saw the needle above the vein. Ganderby, holding the syringe almost flat against the arm, sliding the needle in sideways through the skin into the blue vein, sliding it slowly but so firmly it went in smooth as into cheese. Harry looked at the ceiling and closed his eyes and opened them again, but he didn't move. When it was finished, Ganderby leaned forward, putting his mouth close to Harry's ear. Now you'll be all right, even if you are bitten. But don't move. Please don't move. I'll be back in a moment. He picked up his bag and went out into the hall, and I followed. Is he safe now? I asked. No. Well, how safe is he? The little Indian doctor stood there in the hall, rubbing his lower lip. It must give him some protection, mustn't it? I asked. He turned away and walked to the screen doors that led out onto the veranda. I thought he was going through them, but he stopped at the side of the doors and stood looking out into the night. Isn't the serum any good? I asked. Unfortunately, no, he answered without turning around. It might save him. It might not. I am trying to think of something else to do. Shall we draw the sheet back quick and brush it off before it has time to strike? Never! We are not entitled to take a risk. He spoke sharply, and the voice was pitched a little higher than usual. Well, we can't very well leave him lying there, I said. He's getting nervous. Please, please, he said, turning around, holding both hands up in the air. Not so fast, please. This is not a matter to rush into bald-headed. He wiped his forehead with his handkerchief and stood there, frowning, nibbling his lip. You see, he said at last, there is a way to do this. You know what we must do? We must administer an anesthetic to the creature where it lies. It was a splendid idea. It is not safe, he continued, because the snake is cold-blooded, and anesthetic does not work so well or so quick with such animals. But it is better than any other thing to do. We could use ether, chloroform, He was speaking slowly and trying to think the thing out while he talked. What shall we use? Chloroform, he said suddenly. Ordinary chloroform. That is best. Now, quick. He took my arm and pulled me toward the balcony. Drive to my house. By the time you get there, I will have waked up my boy on the telephone, and he will show you my poisons cupboard. Here is the key of the cupboard. Take a bottle of chloroform. It has an orange label, and the name is printed on it. I stay here in case anything happens. Be quick now. Hurry. No. You don't need your shoes. I drove fast, and in about 15 minutes I was back with the bottle of chloroform. Ganderbite came out of Harry's room and met me in the hall. You got it? He said. Good. I just been telling him what we're going to do. But now we must hurry. It is not easy for him in there, like that, all this time. I'm afraid he might move. He went back to the bedroom and I followed, carrying the bottle carefully with both hands. Harry was lying on the bed in precisely the same position as before, with the sweat pouring down his cheeks. His face was white and wet. He turned his eyes toward me, and I smiled at him and nodded confidently. He continued to look at me. I raised my thumb, giving him the OK signal. He closed his eyes. Ganderby was squatting down by the bed, and on the floor beside him was the hollow rubber tube that he had previously used as a tourniquet, and he got a small paper funnel fitted into one end of the tube. He began to pull a little piece of the sheet out from under the mattress. He was working directly in line with Harry's stomach, about 18 inches from it, and I watched his fingers as they tugged gently at the edge of the sheet. He worked so slowly, it was almost impossible to discern any movement either in his fingers or in the sheet that was being pulled. Finally, he succeeded in making an opening under the sheet, and he took the rubber tube and inserted one end of it into the opening so that it would slide under the sheet along with the mattress toward Harry's body. I do not know how long it took him to slide that tube in a few inches. It may have been 20 minutes, it may have been 40. I never once saw the tube move. I knew it was going in because the visible part of it grew gradually shorter, but I doubted that the crate could have felt even the faintest vibration. Ganderby himself was sweating now, large pearls of sweat standing out all over his forehead and along his upper lip. But his hands were steady, and I noticed that his eyes were watching, not the tube in his hands, but the area of crumpled sheet above Harry's stomach. Without looking up, he held out a hand to me for the chloroform. I twisted out the ground glass stopper and put the bottle right into his hand, not letting go till I was sure he had a good hold on it. Then he jerked his head for me to come closer, and he whispered, "Tell him I'm going to soak the mattress, and that it will be very cold under his body. He must be ready for that, and he must not move. Tell him now." I bent over Harry and passed on the message. "Why doesn't he get on with it?" Harry said. He's going to now, Harry, but it'll feel very cold, so be ready for it. Oh, gosh, get on with it. For the first time he raised his voice, and Ganderby glanced up sharply, watched him for a few seconds, then went back to his business. Ganderby poured a few drops of chloroform into the paper funnel and waited until it ran down the tube. Then he poured some more. Then he waited again, and the heavy, sickening smell of chloroform spread out over the room, bringing with it a faint, unpleasant memories of white-coated nurses and white surgeons standing in a white room around a long white table. Ganderby was pouring steadily now, and I could see the heavy vapor of the chloroform swirling slowly like smoke above the paper funnel. He paused, held the bottle up to the light, poured one more funnelful, and handed the bottle back to me. Slowly, he drew out the rubber tube from under the sheet and then stood up. The strain of inserting the tube and pouring the chloroform must have been great. And I recollect that when Ganderby turned and whispered to me, his voice was small and tired. "We'll give it 15 minutes, just to be safe." I leaned over to tell Harry, "We're going to give it 15 minutes, mate, just to be safe. But it's probably done for already." "Then why, for goodness sake, don't you look and see?" Again he spoke loudly, and Ganderby sprang round, his small brown face suddenly very angry. He had almost pure black eyes, and he stared at Harry, and Harry's smiling muscles started to twitch. I took my handkerchief and wiped at his wet face, trying to stroke his forehead a little for comfort as I did so. Then we stood and waited beside the bed, Ganderby watching Harry's face all the time in a curious, intense manner. The little Indian man was concentrating all his willpower on keeping Harry quiet. He never once took his eyes from the patient, and although he made no sound, he seemed somehow to be shouting at him all the time, saying, "Now listen, you got to listen. You're not going to go spoiling this now, do you hear me?" And Harry lay there twitching his mouth, sweating, closing his eyes, opening them, looking at me, at the sheet, at the ceiling, at me again, but never at Ganderby. Yet somehow Ganderby was holding him. The smell of chloroform was oppressive, and it made me feel sick. But I couldn't leave the room now. I had the feeling someone was blowing up a huge balloon, and I could see it was going to burst, but I couldn't look away. At length, Ganderby turned and nodded, and I knew he was ready to proceed. "You go over to the other side of the bed," he said. "We will each take one side of the sheet and draw it back together, but very slowly, please, and very quietly." "All right, keep still now, Harry," I said, and I went around to the other side of the bed and took hold of the sheet. Ganderby stood opposite me, and together we began to draw back the sheet, lifting it up clear of Harry's body, taking it back very slowly, both of us standing well away, but at the same time bending forward, trying to peer underneath it. The smell of chloroform was awful. I remember trying to hold my breath, and when I couldn't do that any longer, I tried to breathe shallow so the stuff wouldn't get into my lungs. The whole of Harry's chest was visible now, or rather, the striped pajama top which covered it, and then I saw a white cord of his pajama trousers neatly tied in a bow. A little farther, and I saw a button, a mother-of-pearl button, and that was something I had never had on my pajamas, a fly button, let alone a mother-of-pearl one. This Harry, I thought. He is very refined. It is odd how one sometimes has frivolous thoughts at exciting moments, and I distinctly remember thinking about Harry being very refined when I saw that button. Apart from the button, there was nothing on his stomach. We pulled the sheet back faster then, and when we had uncovered his legs and feet, we let the sheet drop over the end of the bed and onto the floor. "Don't move," Ganderby said. "Don't move, Mr. Pope." And he began to peer around along the side of Harry's body and under his legs. "We must be very careful," he said. "It may be anywhere. It could be up the leg of his pajamas." When Ganderby said this, Harry quickly raised his head from the pillow and looked down at his legs. It was the first time he had moved. Then suddenly he jumped up, stood on his bed, and shook his legs one after the other violently into the air. At that moment, we both thought he'd been bitten, and Ganderby was already reaching down into the bag for his scalpel and a tourniquet when Harry ceased his caperings and stood still and looked at the mattress he was standing on and shouted, "It's not there!" Ganderby straightened up, and for a moment he too looked at the mattress. Then he looked up at Harry. Harry was all right. He hadn't been bitten, and now he wasn't going to get bitten, and he wasn't going to be killed, and everything was fine. But that didn't seem to make anyone feel better. "Mr. Pope, you are, of course, quite sure you saw it in the first place?" There was a note of sarcasm in Ganderby's voice that he would never have employed in ordinary circumstances. "You don't think you might possibly have been dreaming, do you, Mr. Pope?" The way Ganderby was looking at Harry, I realized that the sarcasm was not seriously intended. He was only easing up a bit after the strain. Harry stood on his bed in his striped pajamas, glaring at Ganderby, and the color began to spread out over his cheeks. "Are you telling me I'm a liar?" he shouted. Ganderby remained absolutely still, watching Harry. Harry took a pace forward on the bed, and there was a shining look in his eyes. "Why, you dirty little rat!" "Shut up, Harry," I said. "You dirty so-and Harry," I called. "Shut up, Harry." It was terrible things he was saying. Ganderby went out of the room as though neither of us was there, and I followed him and put my arm around his shoulder as he walked across the hall and out into the balcony. "Don't you listen to Harry," I said. "This thing's made him so he doesn't know what he's saying." We went down the steps from the balcony to the drive, and across the drive in the darkness where his old Morris car was parked. He opened the door and got in. "You did a wonderful job," I said. "Thank you so very much for coming." "All he needs is a good holiday," he said quietly, without looking at me. Then he started the engine and drove off. So, was there really a snake on Harry Pope's chest? Or was it all a mind trick? I'll leave that up to you to decide. But I think there's one thing we can all agree on. We could all use a well-deserved holiday. Take care of each other. I'll see you next time.